of the 19th century. And of course, Lieutenant General Buratai's very long and incisive presentation, having been not only a student of history, General Buratai is also a professor at large at the Nigerian University. So, and then of course, be the war commander who captured Camp Zero in the Sambisa forest. So he's both a practitioner as well as an academic of sorts. And then I also had Dawood Abdallah giving a very lengthy. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to talk like an historian. Let me, for today's purpose, talk like a political scientist. I'm going to be very contemporary. I'm not going to bother you with the long historical outline, which has already been given, which is fairly well known. And there isn't much contest among scholars as to the background of the Boko Haram insurgency, or as to the management or mismanagement of the Boko Haram crisis itself by the various actors. The federal government of Nigeria, the Nigerian military, civil society, the subnational governments of the affected states. My position has always been that we are where we are today because the Boko Haram insurgency was heavily mismanaged. We wouldn't have been here if it had been managed well. Unfortunately, we approached Boko Haram like Maitasine, and it turned out to be a 21st century Maitasine. It is very, very complex, evolving, and intractable. So it is because of this complexity that this afternoon I'm going to talk about the exit strategy. How do we exit from the Boko Haram insurgency? I'm going to propose some outlines. I am not sure I have a solution because there is no silver bullet. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to an insurgency that has taken us this long. And of course, unlike the Jamiat Islamiyah in Egypt or the PAC in Colombia, is not going to last this long. But we've declared the death of the insurgency, God knows, at least for the past 6, or if you go by government spokespeople, for the last 8 years. We are not where we were in 2014, definitely. There has been tremendous improvement. But we are not where we want to be because there is still, Boko Haram has been substantially degraded, but it still has sufficient force to make parts of our states ungovernable. It has sufficient force to still engage our security forces, including, if we go by the news, the killing of a DPO in New Marte only last week, or it's no more than a week ago. So they still have some capacity to make life abnormal for us. And that's the essence of every terrorism. The essence of a terrorist is not to overthrow your government. It's not to capture your state, but make life abnormal. Life is abnormal. As we are coming into University of Maiduguri this morning, it looked like we were entering, a military camp, heavily fortified with soldiers, armed soldiers by your university gate, Mr. Vice Chancellor, the Nigerian University is not this fortified. But okay, we are a little distant from the insurgency. We are at least like 10 kilometers away from the danger zone where we are in view. Now, insurgencies typically end in one of four ways. Government defeating the insurgency, the insurgents defeating the government, a prolonged impasse, or a negotiated settlement. These are the one of the four pathways to ending an insurgency. There is no fifth way. It looks like, in our own case, because I said the forces of Boko Haram have been substantially degraded, they've been degraded as a result of sustained military pressure, internal fights among themselves, and believe you me, like General Winter in the Second World War, as a result of lack of food in the areas where the insurgents live. Because they were not very strategic enough, they engaged in scorched earth policy in the areas that they occupied, such that the areas, wherever it is that the Boko Haram are living on, the areas have virtually been completely denuded of food. So Sambisa is no longer livable. And that is why occasionally we get attacks in the fringes of Sambisa, areas around Garkida, parts of Gombe local government areas, around Riji and Pota, always going out looking for food to loot or animals to capture because there is no food. And if the military will only cordon off Boko Haram in their enclaves and ensure that food does not enter, the mass surrender that you see will only increase, even without shooting a single bullet. So logistics is key to the success of any military operation, whether by conventional forces or by guerrilla forces. And once your area is denuded of food, you do not have a area that can supply, then your campaign, sooner or later, will come to an end. I make a submission that some form of a negotiated peace settlement will end the insurgency sustainably. Anything other than some form of a negotiated settlement will lead to prolongation of the conflict, because you are dealing with two or more different insurgent groups broken into different cells without definite central commands. So even decapitation is not likely to help, as seen in the killing of Shekau or of Al-Barnawi, on the shores of the lake. So some form of a negotiated settlement. I don't know how that will come about. Force is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for ending the Boko Haram insurgency. Force is definitely important, but definitely it will not lead to end of the conflict. But a sustained force will push them to want to exit, will push them to want to negotiate, will push the dogs among them to want to come out and perhaps negotiate and reduce the potency of the hawks within those groups. In Nigeria, there have been several models of dealing with exit of Boko Haram insurgents. in addition to several others that did not make the news. The three main models which I'm going to highlight here are the Operation Safe Corridor, which is largely driven by the military. The military is fighting, but the military, since the National Counter-Terrorism Strategy, has also agreed to do what it calls soft options or non-kinetic options in dealing with the Boko Haram insurgency. So the Operation Safe Corridor is military driven, which is very overt, which is known to everybody. It is located at Malan Sidi in Gombe. Then there is the Operation Sulhu, which is covert, driven by the Department of State Security. Since 2019, the Operation Sulhu began towards the end of 2015, but effectively in 2016. And then you have the Borno model of the DDRR, for which you see Governor Zulum running around all over, particularly following the massive exit of ex-insurgents or people associated with insurgency, particularly from the Sambisa axis. As of last year, there were said to be about 95,000. And it is an ongoing thing. As early as sometime last week, there was a report of a commander with some number of low-risk associates who had come out and surrendered. But this time, I think it's on the Lake Chad, Iswak axis. Now, the mandate of the Operation Safe Corridor is to de-radicalize, rehabilitate, and reinsert disengaged insurgents, what the military calls low risk, quote unquote, low risk disengaged insurgents into their communities. Later on, some insurgents that were, or some quote unquote, alleged insurgents, either released from Giwa Barracks, which is very close to your university, or from Kainji, or from some of the prisons around, or convicted who had finished their terms, or those discharged by the courts, were also added to the Operation Safe Corridor mandate. The Operation Safe Corridor is basically a 24-week program divided into 3 phases. And the 3 phases basically are what you call reception and documentation, where disengaged insurgents are taken, they are received, profiled, and documented. Then the second phase is de-radicalization and rehabilitation, which is more difficult, of course, than phase 1. And the third phase is reintegration back into their communities. The reintegration element has been the most difficult of the 3 phases of the Operation Safe Corridor. So basically, there are issues with the Operation Safe Corridor. Low risk has not been defined. Who is low risk? So this is one of the major drawbacks of the Operation Safe Corridor. Another major shortcoming of the Operation Safe Corridor is its focus on defectors, but not on collective disengagement. I mean, a few people who, for whatever reason, feel aggrieved and decide to leave and surrender are taken as defectors. What we should work on is to work on collective disengagement of units or cells or larger groups. If all you will get is just the little Boko Haram unit that works around maybe Jakana, Auno, and Jimtilo, is better than getting just one or two defectors from other units. So, this emphasis on defectors rather than a collective disengagement is for me also a major challenge of the Operation Safe Corridor. Then the stigma by receiving communities. I've said that the integration aspect has become the most difficult of the aspects. And then this low number of those between 2015 and now, the Operation Safe Corridor has dealt with just 3,900 or so, which is only a drop in the ocean. The 95 that defected, who are in Zulum's camp, are not all Boko Haram. Some of them were farmers whose area was taken over by Boko Haram but could not escape. Some of them are persons associated with Boko Haram, including minors and women. And of course, some were real hardcore Boko Haram fighters. Because Boko Haram never had 95,000 armed membership. So these are just some of the. And why don't we have a successful re-entry? Part of the reason why it is difficult to have a successful re-entry is the lack of a national legal framework for re-entry. Yes, Operation Safe Corridor is driven by the DHU, yes. Operation Sulhud by the DSS, yes. But under what platform? What is the legal framework? On what basis are they doing this? They are in no position to provide an amnesty. They are in no position to pardon because the legal instrument for the exit is not on ground. Then the second one is the Operation Sulhu, which started in 2019, and it is a consequence of the negotiation for the release of the Chibok girls abducted in April 2014. The DSS had been in the forefront of the negotiation, using mediators. And as you know, some of the captured girls were released as a result of the negotiations. Once they saw this window of opportunity, that glimmer of hope, they decided to go a step further to say, why don't we work to see if we can get some of the high-level Boko Haram commanders to surrender. So the Operation Sulhu is basically an attempt not at low risk, but high risk Boko Haram commanders with a view to bringing them back to society. The Sulhu, as an approach of DDR, has 5 components. These are basically negotiation for disengagement, then exit and reception, transit and signature, rehabilitation and reintegration. Again, Sulhu is also arising from the Office of the National Security Advisor's National Counter-Terrorism Strategy, NATES, 2016. That is why Sulhu is supposed to offer full pardon. However, the exceptions are those who have committed grievous offenses under the Rome Statute, including war commanders that committed mass murders, genocide, ethnic cleansing, or sociocide, killing of whole communities. Now, the third component of the DDR ongoing is what is called the Borno model, driven by Governor Babagana Umara Zulum. It arose from the desire of the government of Borno State to manage mass exit coming as from 2021. The first batch of 3,900 was said to have exited on the 5th of July 2021. As at last year, October last year, 95,000 was said to have existed. Of the 95,000, less than 10% are believed to be Boko Haram fighters. But the profiling, the documentation, and the biometric data capture is still ongoing. The 3D, 3R, the Borno model, is disarmament, de-radicalization, demobilization, rehabilitation, reconciliation, and reintegration. All the three are based on a model of post-conflict peace building called DDR. Demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. Those exiting in the Borno model are usually given 3 months of food ration, a vocational package based on the vocation for which they are trained, whether it is tailoring, woodwork and carpentry, metal work or whatever. So maybe sewing machine, maybe saws and so on and so forth, the basic equipment, and some cash grant. So this is usually the exit under the Borno model. According to those handling the program, including 6,900 of the low risks have been de-radicalized and reinserted back into communities. The major challenges of the Borno model are lack of a systematic reintegration program. Because of the lack of a national framework, nobody knows the criteria or the system of reintegration back into the communities. Following closely is the same issue that I raised, lack of a national legal framework. Remember, Borno is only one of 36 states of the Federation. And whatever it is that the government does in Borno will not have a legal backing without a national framework, because matters of the territorial defense of this country, including internal security, are exclusively matters for the federal government of Nigeria. So, for the Borno model to be successful, it has to be appropriated and taken over by the federal government of Nigeria. And then, of course, the inadequacy of funding. The inadequacy of funding arises from the limited funds available to the state government. Of course, funds available to the federal government is not infinite, but definitely it is more than funds available to a subnational government. And two, the lack of a definite criteria on who is eligible and who is not eligible for entering the program in the first instance. So these are just some of the three major ones. Now, how do we exit? I have some proposals. For exit of insurgents to be successful, certain conditions need to exist. One, there's a need to end the conflict and arrive at some form of a negotiated settlement, a peace agreement, a peace accord. Because no DDR anywhere in the world is going to succeed for as long as the conflict is hot and ongoing. DDR presupposes a post-conflict situation. But here you are dealing with insurgency, engaging in DDR, your troops are still engaged in fighting, communities are being attacked, where casualties are being taken on both sides. So there is a need for some form of a negotiated settlement, some form of a peace accord, and it is the peace accord that will, in any DDR, form the bedrock for the exit of insurgents. The DDR, the peace accord will determine, one, end of conflict, two, who is eligible for either pardon or amnesty, three, it is the peace accord that will also provide the roadmap for transitional justice, dealing with very serious criminals who have engaged in mass murders while giving amnesty or pardon to low-risk foot soldiers and so on and so forth. So that will only come as a result of a peace accord. The legal framework will arise from a peace accord. The peace accord will also determine the timelines, the benchmarks, and the deliverables. So that if you have it in 2024, then you can say that by 2025, we will have finished our documentation. By 2026, we will have reinserted this percentage back into civil society. By 2027, we will have mopped up all small arms and light weapons, both from ex-insurgents and from the civil populace, etc., etc. So these timelines, benchmarks, and deliverables will be clearly outlined in the peace accord. That's the national legal instrument. Then, of course, the need for a national framework. Like I said, a DDR is the exclusive preserve of the federal government of Nigeria, and not that of a state government like Borno. Assuming you're successful with your DDR in Borno, what do you do to insurgents that are across the border, let's say in Yobe and in Adamawa State or in Gombe State? How do you deal with insurgents across the border, just 500 meters from Banki, or across the border in Kusri, or on the islands and islets of the Lake Chad? It has to be a national framework so that you can also deal regionally, either under the MNJTF or the Lake Chad-based commission, or under an AU kind of agreement. But if you localize, yeah, you can solve a problem by dealing it at the state level, but you have already started seeing the limitations, of what a state government can do. We do understand the zeal, we do understand the impatience of Governor Zulum, but he still needs to. This is a federal government responsibility to which he can push the federal government to be faster than it is, but it is not a responsibility that a state governor can take. There's a need for an eligibility criteria, which we said should come from the national framework, and the need to balance equity and security. What governments want now is security, is ex-insurgents coming back so that we can bring security back into our communities. But what about equity? What about those who were forcibly conscripted into the insurgency because their communities were attacked? What about women and children who were possibly taken into captivity by the insurgents? Some of them married up forcibly. What about villagers and farmers who found themselves on the wrong side of the border as a result of the insurgency? Because typical villagers, in my own village, during the Boko Haram insurgency, in my own village, when Boko Haram come, my brothers and sisters will run away across the border into Niger. That will give you an idea where maybe if you know the geography very well, you probably will know my village. When Boko Haram retreats, they will come back. But when Nigerian forces come into my village, my brothers and sisters will also run across the border. They did not trust anybody, not our military in uniform, not Boko Haram. And for that reason, the casualty level in my village is low. They didn't allow themselves to be killed by anybody. The military did not see them as sympathizers, and Boko Haram did not see them as conniving with the Nigerian military. So these were just some of the local adaptation and resilience. Funding the DDR program is expensive, and of course, so what is the way forward? Let me just conclude by just giving a few suggestions on the way forward, because I've been reminded that my time is off. The federal government of Nigeria should own both the military and the soft options, because as it is now, what the federal government knows is primarily the military option. The federal government of Nigeria should also instrumentalize a legal framework and clearly state whether it is giving amnesty or whether it is pardoning, because a clarity will help in the exit of those who are holding, non-state actors who are holding arms. Because as it is now, there is no clarity on how to deal with disengaged insurgents. And if you talk to disengaged insurgents, they are still afraid of coming out. Because an armed insurgent coming out of the bush, God help him if he were to only meet armed soldiers without their either platoon or company commander. But where you have military officers, they are likely to get better treatment than if they were to meet non-commissioned officers. There is a need to establish an office for dealing with DDR and also dealing with vigilante groups such as the Civilian Joint Task Force. Because at the end of the conflict,